They say Joan Miller's memory is a fog-filled room, a place where truth and hallucinations blur into one. But even in the haze, Joan knows one thing for certain. That medicine cup was not empty before she left for dinner. Across the room, her son-in-law stands smiling with the face of a guardian angel, but his eyes dance with the chilling delight of a predator. He claims he saw her take her pills. Her own daughter believes him. Together, they are slowly convincing her that she is losing her mind, that she is becoming her own greatest enemy. Yet, deep within the gaps of her fading memories, an ancient instinct screams a warning. Do not trust that man. He didn't come to save her. He came to bury her alive in the silence of her own home. She is Dr. Joan Miller, a woman losing herself to time, but this is the story of how she used the final fragments of her logic to unmask the devil hiding in plain sight. This is a war where her only weapon is the sound of the past. If you are listening from anywhere in the world, please leave a comment and subscribe, because there are truths that need to be spread, even if they might shake your very beliefs. Some stories, no matter how painful they are, simply must be told. Late November, snow had already begun to blanket the Colorado Rockies when the silence in the house became unbearable. It was a magnificent home, the kind featured in architectural magazines, timber beams, floor-to-ceiling glass looking out over the maroon bells, and enough square footage to house a small army. But since Robert died, the house had felt less like a home and more like a tomb. Joan stood in the kitchen, staring at the granite countertop. In her hand was a carton of milk. She knew it belonged in the refrigerator. She knew this with the intellectual certainty of a PhD holder. And yet, she had been standing there for 2 full minutes, unable to remember which stainless steel door opened to the fridge and which one was the wine cooler. "Focus, Joan," she whispered. Her voice sounded thin in the vast space. She opened the left door. Wine. She closed it. Opened the right. Food. Success, she muttered, sliding the milk onto the shelf. She grabbed a yellow sticky note from the pad she kept by the coffee maker. She wrote the date and time. November 24, 8:15, a.m. Milk put away. The kitchen was covered in them. Yellow squares like autumn leaves stuck to cabinets, doors, and mirrors. Turn off stove. Keys in the bowl. Appointment with Dr. Evans at 2 p.m. But there was one note that wasn't in my handwriting. It sat on the center of the kitchen island, a small, aggressive square of blue. "Joan, stop hiding the silver spoons in the garden." My breath hitched. I had no memory of the spoons, let alone the garden, but the ink was fresh, and the logic of a madwoman was being written for me by a hand that wasn't mine. This was her life now, a series of external hard drives for a crashing computer. The diagnosis had come 6 months ago. Early onset Alzheimer's with aggressive progression. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had spent her career studying memory, trauma, and the subconscious. Now, she was the subject. It started with keys, then names, then, terrifyingly, entire afternoons would vanish into a gray void, leaving her standing in the middle of a room with no idea how she got there. Joan took her coffee and walked to the sanctuary. Robert's study. She hadn't changed a thing since his heart attack a year ago. The room still smelled of his cherry pipe tobacco and old paper. The walls were lined with books, but the soul of the room was in the corner. The turntable. A vintage record player setup, worth more than most cars, connected to towering walnut speakers. And the records. Thousands of them. Robert Miller hadn't just been a psychiatrist. He had been obsessed with vinyl records. He believed that the human voice, captured on analog vinyl, held truths that digital files erased. The cracks, the pops, the breath between words. "Joni," he used to say, "that's where the soul hides." Joan ran her finger along the spines of the record sleeves. Beethoven, Bach, Coltrane, and on the bottom shelf, the private collection records he had made himself, using a record-cutting machine in the basement. Recordings of his own thoughts, his journals. He never wrote things down. He spoke them into the groove of a record. She pulled out a disc labeled Sovereign, 1998. She didn't know why she chose that one. Maybe just to feel the weight of it. She placed it on the platter, lifted the tone arm, and dropped the needle. Static, pop, hiss. Then, Robert's voice filled the room, warm and steady. Session notes. Patient 402. The narcissism is evolving. He doesn't just want success, he wants to erase his origins. He speaks of his past like it's a disease he's cured. Joan closed her eyes, letting the tears come. It felt like he was in the room. Suddenly, a flash of movement outside the window caught her eye. She stopped the record. Through the massive glass pane, she looked down the snowy driveway. A black Range Rover was pulling up to the gate. She checked her watch. 8:30 a.m. She checked her yellow notes. Nothing. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in her chest. Had she forgotten a visitor? Was it the cleaners? She walked to the intercom. Hello? Mom? It's us. Sarah. Her daughter. Sarah? Joan frowned. Honey, did we have plans? A pause. Then, a male voice, smooth as velvet, cut in. Joan, it's Mark. We talked about this yesterday. Remember? We're moving in today. Joan froze. Moving in? Yesterday? She racked her brain, searching for the memory of a conversation, a phone call, anything. She found nothing but the static. I don't. It's okay, Mom, Mark said, his tone dripping with a patience that felt condescending. Open the gate. We'll explain everything. Joan pressed the button. As the heavy iron gate swung open, she looked back at the turntable. The needle was still resting on the record. She felt a sudden, irrational urge to hide it, to hide everything. Because even through the fog, an instinct ancient and primal was screaming at her. You didn't forget. You never agreed to this. The invasion was swift and efficient. Within an hour, the quiet sanctuary of the lodge was shattered. Movers in blue uniforms hauled boxes with indifference, their boots tracking wet snow onto the Persian rugs. Joan stood by the fireplace, clutching her cardigan, feeling like a ghost in her own life. Careful with that. That's Italian leather. Mark barked at a mover carrying a sofa. He turned to Joan, and his face instantly softened into that perfect, practiced smile. Sorry about the noise, Joan. It'll be over soon. Robert had never liked him. He tries too hard, Joni, Robert had told her once. A man who smiles that much is hiding teeth. Mark, Joan said, trying to keep her voice steady. I really don't recall agreeing to this. I value my independence. Sarah walked over. She looked tired. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and there were dark circles under her eyes. She took Joan's hands. Her palms were damp. Mom, please, Sarah whispered. We talked about this at the hospital. After you left the stove on last week. I didn't leave the stove on, Joan said automatically. You did, Mom, Mark interjected, stepping closer. He loomed over her, smelling of expensive cologne and winter air. The neighbors called the fire department. You don't remember? Joan blinked. Fire department? Sirens? She searched the fractured landscape of her mind. There was a vague shadow of a memory, a flashing red light. But was that last week? Or a year ago? Or a dream? Joan faltered. See? Mark patted her shoulder. His hand was heavy. That's why we're here. To keep you safe. Sarah is worried sick. You don't want to worry, Sarah, do you? It was a masterstroke. He knew Sarah was Joan's weakness. Of course not, Joan whispered. Good. It's settled. Mark clapped his hands. We're taking the east wing. You stay in the master suite. We won't get in your way. I'll handle the bills, the maintenance, the doctors. You just rest. It sounded like a command to die quietly. Later that evening, the house settled into a new, uneasy rhythm. They ate dinner in the formal dining room, a room Joan hadn't used since the funeral. Mark sat at the head of the table, Robert's seat. He poured wine for himself and Sarah, but filled Joan's glass with sparkling water. Better not mix it with your meds, Joan, he said, winking. I haven't taken my evening meds yet, Joan replied, reaching for the salt. Really? Mark paused, the wine bottle hovering. I saw you take them at 5 p.m. I watched you swallow them, Joan froze. No, I was reading in the library at 5. Mark exchanged a look with Sarah. A look of pity. A look that said, see? She's gone. Mom, Sarah said gently, her voice trembling. I saw you take them too. With the orange juice. Joan looked from her daughter to her son-in-law. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She knew she hadn't taken them. She had a system. She put the pills in a little cup by her bedside lamp. They were still there. She was sure of it. Or was she? If 2 people saw it, Maybe the fog was thicker than she thought. Maybe she was losing it faster than the doctors predicted. I apologize, Joan murmured. But internally, the doctor began a diagnostic sweep. Classic gaslighting, isolation, contradiction, and the imposition of a false reality. I didn't shrink. I observed. I watched the way his pupils dilated when he lied, a physiological tell no amount of charm could mask. It's okay. Mark smiled, unaware that I was no longer his victim, but his clinician, documenting the pathology of a killer. After dinner, Joan fled to her room. She needed air. She needed to escape the suffocating kindness of Mark Sterling. She stepped out onto the balcony of the master suite. The night air was biting, well below freezing. The snow glowed blue in the moonlight. She looked out toward the property line, toward the dense pine forest that separated her estate from the nearest neighbor. A flicker of light caught her eye. About 200 yards away, through the trees, a small cabin sat in darkness. It belonged to Elias Thorne. Elias was a hermit, a Vietnam vet, Robert had said. Rude, abrasive, and antisocial. He had once threatened to shoot Robert's dog for barking too loud. But tonight, there was a light on his porch, and in the glow of that light, Joan saw him. Elias was standing there, wrapped in a heavy parka, holding what looked like a telescope or viewing scope. He was looking through it, pointing it directly at her house. Joan didn't recoil. For some strange reason, the sight of the old recluse watching them felt grounding. It was real. It wasn't a memory she could forget. She raised her hand and gave a small, hesitant wave. Elias didn't wave back. He lowered the scope, stared at her for a long moment across the snowy void, and then extinguished his porch light, plunging the cabin back into darkness. Joan went back inside, locking the balcony door. She walked to her bedside table to prepare for sleep. She reached for the little paper cup where she kept her evening pills. It was empty. Joan stared at the empty cup. A chill that had nothing to do with the winter air swept through her body. She remembered seeing the pills there before dinner. Blue and white. 2 of them. She looked at the door to her bedroom. It was closed. I didn't take them, she thought, her mind screaming. I know I didn't. Mark had said he watched her take them. Sarah had agreed. But the cup was empty. Either Joan Miller was losing her mind completely, dissolving into the static, or someone had come into her room while she was at dinner and removed them. It's a chilling moment when you realize the people you trust most are the ones weaving a web of lies around you. Joan is standing on the edge of a terrifying truth, and the isolation she feels is something no one should ever have to endure. Stay with us as we see if her fading memories can still hold onto the light of the truth. Joan sat on the edge of the bed, trembling. She looked at the sticky notes on her mirror. Trust yourself, she had written on one of them weeks ago. She reached out, took a pen, and wrote a new note. Her hand shook, but the letters were bold and dark. They are lying. She stuck it to the back of the family photo frame on her nightstand, hiding it from view. Down the hall, she heard the faint sound of music. Jazz, Coltrane, coming from Robert's study. She hadn't turned the record player off? No, she had. She remembered stopping it when the Range Rover arrived. Mark was in there. In Robert's sanctuary, Joan lay down, pulling the duvet up to her chin, listening to the muffled bass through the walls. She realized then that the silence of the snow was over. The noise had begun, and in the noise, she would have to fight for her life. The war for Joan Miller's sanity did not begin with a shout. It began with a whisper, a misplaced object, a shadow in the hallway. Just over a week into December, it was 2:13 a.m. when Joan woke up. The house was silent, buried under 3 feet of fresh snow. But then, she heard it. Ping, ping, ping. Piano keys, high notes, the opening trill of Debussy's Clair de Lune. Joan sat up, her heart hammering. Robert used to play that, every Sunday morning, and sometimes, when he couldn't sleep, in the dead of night. But Robert was dead. She threw off the covers, her bare feet hitting the cold hardwood floor. She grabbed her robe, her breath misting in the chilly air of the bedroom. The heating was off again. Why was it always off? She crept into the hallway. The music continued stumbling, imperfect, like someone trying to remember a forgotten melody. Is it Sarah? Joan thought. No, Sarah never learned to play. She reached the top of the stairs. The music drifted up from the living room, ghostly and melancholic. Joan gripped the banister, her knuckles white. She descended, one step at a time, the wood creaking under her weight. As she reached the bottom step, the music stopped abruptly. Silence rushed back in, louder than the noise. "Hello?" Joan called out. Her voice trembled. She walked into the living room, fumbling for the light switch. The chandelier flooded the room with harsh yellow light. The room was empty. The grand piano sat in the corner, its lid closed. A layer of dust coated the black lacquer. Joan walked over to it, her hand shaking as she touched the wood. It was cold. If someone had just been playing, the keys would have warmth. The vibration would still hang in the air. Nothing. "Mom?" Joan spun around. Mark stood at the entrance of the hallway. He was wearing silk pajamas, his hair perfectly tousled. He looked like he had just stepped out of a catalog for luxury sleepwear. "Mark," Joan breathed, clutching her chest. "Did you hear that?" "The piano." Mark frowned, tilting his head. "The piano?" "Mom, it's 2 a.m. Someone was playing. Claire de Lune." Mark walked over to her, his movements fluid and predatory. He placed a hand on her shoulder. His palm was warm, uncomfortably so. "Mom," he said softly, his voice dripping with that suffocating pity. "The piano is locked. Remember? Sarah locked it last week because you said the keys were looking at you." Joan blinked. I never said that." "You did," Mark said, his eyes wide with mock sincerity. "You were very upset. We locked it to make you feel safe." He reached down and tugged at the piano lid. It didn't budge. Locked. Joan stared at the instrument. Her mind reeled. Had she hallucinated the music? The trill, the rhythm. It had felt so real. Was her brain creating symphonies now? "Come on," Mark said, guiding her away like a wayward child. "Let's get you back to bed, doctor." Evans said the auditory hallucinations might increase with the new medication. "What new medication?" Joan asked, stopping in her tracks. "The blue pills, Mom. The ones you started Tuesday. I thought those were for my blood pressure." Mark sighed, a sound of infinite, martyred patience. "No, Mom. They're antipsychotics. We talked about this." He led her up the stairs. Joan walked mechanically, her mind fracturing. She remembered the blue pills. She remembered asking what they were, but she couldn't remember the answer. Had he said blood pressure? Or had he said antipsychotic? "Reality testing," her training screamed. "Check the evidence." But she had no evidence, only the empty living room and the locked piano. As Mark tucked her in, pulling the duvet up to her chin, he leaned down. "Sleep tight, Mom. Don't let the ghosts bite." He turned off the lamp and closed the door. Joan lay in the dark, eyes wide open. She waited. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. Then she heard it again, faintly, from downstairs. Ping. One single note. Mark wasn't asleep. He was down there, and he wasn't playing a song. He was playing her. There is a special kind of cruelty in using someone's illness against them, and Mark is proving to be a master of this dark game. It's heartbreaking to watch Joan doubt her own senses. But even in the deepest fog, a mother's instinct is hard to silence. You won't want to miss the next chapter, where a hidden secret begins to surface from the shadows. 10 days before Christmas, the snow had stopped, leaving the world trapped in a blinding white silence. Joan was in the kitchen, staring at a knife block. One knife was missing, the paring knife. She knew she hadn't touched it, but she also knew that in 10 minutes, Mark would come in and ask her where she hid it. It was his new game. Suddenly, a loud, rhythmic pounding echoed through the house. Thud, thud, thud. It came from the front door. Not the polite knock of a guest, but the demanding hammer of law enforcement, or a very angry man. Joan moved toward the hallway, but Mark was already there, striding toward the door with an annoyed expression. "Who the hell is that?" he muttered. He swung the heavy oak door open. A blast of freezing air rushed in, carrying the smell of pine resin, gun oil, and stale tobacco. Standing on the porch was Elias Thorne. He looked like a force of nature carved from the granite of the Rockies. He wore a faded camouflage parka that had seen better decades, stained work pants, and a trapper hat with the ear flaps down. He stood on the porch, gripping a shovel like a broadsword, his pale eyes cutting through the gloom of the storm. "Mr. Thorne," Mark said, his voice instantly switching to his charming neighbor mode, though his body blocked the doorway. To what do we owe the pleasure? We were just— Your lights are giving me a migraine, Elias grunted. His voice sounded like gravel in a blender. Excuse me? Mark blinked. The sensor lights. On the south side. By the study, Elias pointed with his chin. They've been strobing on and off for 3 nights straight. Click, buzz, click, buzz. It's interfering with my observation of the wildlife. Mark laughed. A dismissive, polite sound. I think you're mistaken, Mr. Thorne. Those lights are motion activated. No one goes out there at night. It's probably just the wind triggering the sensors. Wind don't walk in a pattern, Elias said. He didn't move. He didn't smile. Well, I'll have someone check the wiring, Mark said, starting to close the door. Thanks for letting us know. Hold on. Elias jammed the blade of his shovel between the door and the frame. The metal screeched against the wood. Mark stiffened. The smile vanished. For a second, the predator peeked out. Remove the shovel, Elias. I want to speak to the doc, Elias said, ignoring the threat. Mark glanced back and saw Joan standing in the hallway shadows. She's not having a good day, Mark said, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. The dementia. She doesn't recognize people. It's better if— I'm right here. Joan stepped forward. She wrapped her cardigan tighter around herself. She felt small next to these 2 men, one a physical giant, the other a psychological monster. Elias looked at her. He pulled off his sunglasses. His eyes were surprising, pale blue, sharp, and utterly clear. They weren't the eyes of a crazy hermit. They were the eyes of a sniper who had spent 40 years looking for details others missed. You okay, Doc? Elias asked. Joan hesitated. Mark's hand was on the doorknob, his knuckles white. I'm having some memory issues, Elias. Mark says the lights weren't on. Elias looked from Joan to Mark, then back to Joan. He chewed on the inside of his cheek. Mark says a lot of things, Elias rumbled. But I know what I saw. 3 a.m. South window. Someone was digging around the foundation. Thought maybe you got a badger problem. Or maybe you're burying gold. Mark's face went rigid. I was checking the drainage pipes, he lied smoothly, though the delay was palpable. Like I said, maintenance. Elias stared at Mark for a long, uncomfortable second. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. Elias was testing him, and Mark knew it. Drainage, Elias repeated flatly. In frozen ground, right. He pulled the shovel back. You tell your boy here to fix the damn lights, Elias said to Joan, his tone shifting. It wasn't warm, but it was respectful. And Doc, if the noise gets too loud, you know I got insomnia. I'm always up. He turned and trudged back into the snow, his heavy boots crunching loudly. Mark slammed the door and locked it. He let out a breath, then turned to Joan with a sneer. Crazy old bastard. I should call the homeowners association and have him evicted. He's dangerous. He brushed past Joan, heading toward the kitchen. But Joan stood, rooted to the spot, looking at the closed door. Her heart was racing, but not with fear, with adrenaline. Elias had seen the lights. Elias had seen someone digging. Elias had caught Mark in a lie about the drainage. Mark had told Dr. Evans that Joan was hallucinating the digging sounds, but Elias had confirmed them. The fog in Joan's mind cleared for a precious moment. I am not crazy, she realized. I am not imagining the shovel. Mark is looking for something. Sometimes, the validation we need comes from the most unexpected places, even from a grumpy neighbor with a sniper's eye. This small spark of clarity is exactly what Joan needs to stop feeling like a victim and start fighting back. Keep listening, because the hunter is about to realize that his prey is much sharper than he ever imagined. Joan, Mark yelled from the kitchen. Where did you put the paring knife? Joan stared at the closed door. A fragment of clarity sparked in the darkness. She remembered the recording. She remembered Robert's words about patient 402. She didn't smile. She simply stored the information away. A single bullet in an empty gun. I don't remember, Mark, she called back, her voice perfectly tremulous. I just don't remember. Christmas Eve arrived with a strange, expectant silence. Mark left the house just after lunch. I have to meet with the estate lawyers in town, he had told Joan, checking his reflection in the hallway mirror. He adjusted his tie, smoothing out a wrinkle that didn't exist. Sarah is napping. Don't open the door for anyone, especially not that crazy old man next door. I won't, Joan said, sitting in her armchair with a blanket over her lap. She made her eyes look glassy, vacant. She let her mouth hang slightly open. It was a performance. She waited until the taillights of his Range Rover disappeared down the winding, snow-packed driveway. She waited another 2 minutes, counting the seconds allowed to keep her mind anchored. 120. She threw off the blanket. The frail old woman vanished. In her place stood Dr. Joan Miller. She moved quickly to the kitchen. Her mind was a sieve, leaking details, but her logic was still intact. Mark is digging at night. Mark lied about the piano. Mark is afraid of something in Robert's study. She needed a tool. A screwdriver. She opened the junk drawer. Chaos. Batteries. Rubber bands. Takeout menus. She rifled through it, panic rising. Where is it? Robert always kept one here. Her hand closed around a yellow handle. It would have to do. She hurried to the study. The heavy door groaned as she pushed it open. The room was freezing. Mark had turned the vent off in here, likely to discourage her from entering. She went straight to the turntable. The vintage record player, a masterpiece of engineering. Mark had told her it was broken. The motor burned out. Joan leaned over the machine. She lifted the heavy platter. It was solid aluminum. Beneath it, she saw the drive belt. It wasn't broken. It had been slipped off the pulley. Sabotage, she whispered. A simple trick to silence the machine without damaging the resale value. Mark Sterling knew the price of everything and the value of nothing. With trembling fingers, she stretched the rubber belt back over the brass pulley. Her arthritis protested, but she grit her teeth. Snap. It seated perfectly. She put the platter back. Now for the record. She scanned the shelves. Thousands of spines. Where would Robert hide a secret? He wouldn't just file it under C. He was too clever for that. She closed her eyes, trying to summon a memory of Robert. Think, Bob. How did your mind work? She remembered a conversation from 3 years ago. They were drinking wine. Robert was talking about the banality of evil. The darkest secrets, Joni, are always hidden inside the most beautiful things. No one looks for poison in a bouquet of roses. Beautiful things. Joan looked at the shelf of classical operas. Madame Butterfly, Tosca, Turandot, and there it was. The Magic Flute by Mozart, Robert's absolute favorite. A pristine, limited edition box set. She pulled it down. It was heavy. She opened the box. Inside lay 3 vinyl discs, but when she lifted the velvet inlay, she found something else. A 4th disc. No label. Just a date hand-scratched into the black lacquer near the center hole. The 12th of September, 1998. Joan's heart skipped a beat. 1998. The year Robert had taken a sabbatical. The year he had worked at the State Psychiatric Hospital in Chicago. The year he had come home gray-faced and silent. She placed the black disc on the turntable. She flipped the switch. The green lights glowed. The platter began to spin. She lowered the tone arm. The silence before the sound was the loudest thing she had ever heard. Hiss, crackle, the sound of a match being struck, the inhale of a pipe. Then, Robert's voice filled the freezing room. It wasn't the warm, husbandly voice Joan missed. It was his doctor voice, clinical, detached, dangerous. Session 12. Subject, Marcus S. Diagnosis, malignant narcissism with psychopathic tendencies. The patient is highly intelligent and completely devoid of empathy. Joan gripped the edge of the desk. Marcus. Another voice spoke. Young, smooth, arrogant. Even through the distortion of the vinyl, the cadence was unmistakable. You sound disappointed, Doc. I thought you liked intelligent conversation. Most of the people in here just drool and scream. It was Mark, 25 years younger. But it was him. Tell me about your father, Marcus, Robert said on the recording. A laugh, cold and sharp. My father? The janitor? The man who smelled like bleach and failure? What's there to tell? He was a small man. He lived a small life. And he died a small death. Diabetic coma, Robert noted. Insulin overdose. An accident, Marcus said. Poor old Frank Reynolds, eyesight failing, must have dialed up the wrong dose in the syringe. Tragedy, really. The insurance payout was modest, but enough to get me into business school. Enough to buy a new suit, a new name. Joan stopped breathing. Mark hadn't just changed his name. He had murdered his own father to fund his reinvention. The recording continued. The young Mark sounded bored, as if discussing the weather. You know, Doc, the world is divided into two kinds of people, the ones who wait for permission and the ones who take what they deserve. I deserve to be at the top. I deserve the view from the summit. And if I have to step on a few ants to get there, well, that's just gravity. And what happens, Robert asked quietly, when someone recognizes you? When someone sees the ant on your shoe? I wipe it off, Marcus replied instantly. Clean, efficient, like it was never there. A long pause on the record. I'm recommending you be transferred to a secure ward, Marcus. You are a danger to society. You can recommend whatever you want, old man. But you can't hold me. I'm smarter than you. I'm smarter than all of you. I'll be out in 6 months. And one day, maybe I'll come find you. Maybe I'll marry your daughter. Wouldn't that be poetic? To take everything you love, piece by piece, just because you tried to cage me. The past has a strange way of catching up to those who try to bury it. And Robert's voice from the grave might just be Joan's only hope. Knowing that Mark's presence in this house was never an accident, but a cold-blooded plan for revenge, changes everything. Stick around to find out how Joan plans to use this fragile fragment of the past against a man who thinks he's already won. Click. The recording ended. Joan stood paralyzed. The room spun. It wasn't just greed. It wasn't just money. It was revenge. Mark had targeted Sarah not out of love, but out of spite. He had spent 20 years planning this long con to destroy the man who had diagnosed him. And since Robert was dead, Joan was the proxy victim. He wasn't digging in the yard for gold. He was digging for this. He knew Robert had recorded the sessions. He knew there was evidence. Suddenly, lights swept across the wall. Engine noise. Joan snapped her head toward the window. The Range Rover was back. He was early. Too early. Panic, hot and blinding, flooded her brain. Hide it. You have to hide it. She grabbed the record off the platter. Her hands were shaking so badly she almost dropped it. She shoved it back into the magic flute box. The sound of the garage door opening rumbled through the floorboards. The belt. She had to take the belt off. If Mark saw the turntable working, he would know. She lifted the heavy aluminum platter. She reached for the rubber belt. It was tight. Her arthritic fingers slipped. The front door opened downstairs. Sarah? Joan? Mark's voice. Cheerful. Terrifying. Joan yanked the belt. It popped off. She dropped the platter back down. Clang. It was too loud. Hello? Mark called out. Closer now. Is someone in the study? Joan grabbed the screwdriver. She shoved it into her pocket. She smoothed her hair. She needed an alibi. Why was she in here? She looked around frantically. Her eyes landed on an old photo album on the shelf. She grabbed it, sat in Robert's leather chair, and opened it to a random page. Footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate. The door handle turned. Mark stood in the doorway. He was still wearing his coat. Snowflakes melted on his shoulders. He looked at the turntable, then at Joan. His eyes narrowed. Mom? He said softly. What are you doing in here? It's freezing. Joan looked up. She forced tears into her eyes. It wasn't hard. She was terrified. I missed him, she whispered, her voice cracking. She pointed to the photo album. I just wanted to see his face. But I can't remember his voice. Mark, I can't remember what he sounded like. She started to sob, burying her face in her hands. Mark stood still for a long moment. His gaze swept the room. He looked at the turntable. The dust cover was slightly askew. He walked over to her. The floorboards creaked. He placed a hand on the back of her head. It's okay, he cooed. Memory is a tricky thing. Sometimes it's better to forget. He leaned down, whispering into her ear. But you shouldn't be in here, Mom. The floor is uneven. You could fall. And if you fall, you might not get up. He straightened up, his face back to the mask of the dutiful son. Come on, let's get you some tea. You're shivering. Joan let him lead her out. But as she passed the threshold, she felt the weight of the screwdriver in her pocket. She had a weapon now. Not the screwdriver, the truth. She knew who he was. She knew his name. Marcus. And for the first time since the diagnosis, the white noise was gone. The board was set. The game had begun. By 6 that evening, the blizzard arrived with the violence of a sledgehammer. Wind howled against the reinforced glass, turning the view of the mountains into a swirling vortex of black and white. Inside, the lodge felt like a pressurized cabin, the air thick with unspoken threats. Joan sat at the dining table. Her hands were folded in her lap, gripping the yellow handle of the screwdriver hidden in her sleeve. The metal was warm against her wrist, a secret comfort. "Where is Sarah?" Joan asked. Her voice was steady, too steady for a woman supposedly lost in dementia. Mark emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray, tomato soup and grilled cheese, comfort food, or prison rations. "Sarah is not feeling well," Mark said, placing the bowl in front of Joan. "She had a migraine. I gave her something to help her sleep. She's out cold." Out cold. The phrasing was deliberate. Joan looked at the soup. It smelled of basil and oregano. It also smelled of danger. "I'm not hungry," Joan said. "Eat, Mom." Mark sat opposite her, leaning forward, his elbows on the table. His gaze was fixed and cold, stripped of the performative warmth he used for the neighbors. "You need your strength." The storm knocked out the landlines. "Cell towers are down too. We're all alone up here." He smiled. It wasn't a nice smile, just us family. On Christmas Eve, Joan pushed the bowl away. "I want to see my daughter." "You know," Mark said, ignoring her request. "I was looking through Robert's record collection earlier, after I put you to bed for your nap." Joan's heart slammed against her ribs. "He had terrible taste in opera," Mark continued, picking up a spoon and swirling it in Joan's soup. "But he was organized, alphabetical, chronological, so imagine my surprise when I found the magic flute box set. Slightly out of alignment." He stopped swirling. He looked up, and inside, the dust jacket was warm, as if someone had just held it. The silence stretched, elastic and terrifying. The wind screamed outside, but inside, the only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock. "I don't know what you're talking about," Joan whispered, reverting to her confused persona. I was looking for pictures." Mark laughed. A low, dry sound. "Drop it, Joan." The command was like a whip crack. "Drop the act," Mark said, his voice dropping an octave, losing all warmth. "I know you didn't take your pills. I found them in the plant pot by the window. The ficus is dying, by the way." He stood up and walked slowly around the table until he was standing right behind her chair. He leaned down, his lips brushing her ear. "You listened to it, didn't you?" "Disc number 4. Joan closed her eyes. There was no point in hiding anymore. The fog was gone. The game was up. She turned in her chair to face him. She summoned every ounce of dignity she possessed. She wasn't the victim. She was the prosecutor. "Hello, Marcus," she said clearly. Mark didn't flinch. If anything, he looked delighted. A narcissistic gleam entered his eyes, the joy of finally being recognized for his genius. "Hello, doctor," he whispered. "Took you long enough. Robert figured it out in 3 sessions. You took 3 months. You killed your father," Joan said, her voice shaking with rage. "And you killed my husband." "Robert?" Mark straightened his suit jacket. "Robert was a heart attack waiting to happen. I just increased the stress levels. A few misplaced files, a few anonymous threats. Nature took its course." "And Sarah?" "Sarah is an investment," Mark shrugged. "A boring, needy investment. But once I have the conservatorship fully secured, well, accidents happen in the mountains. Skiing is such a dangerous sport." Joan lunged. It was a desperate, foolish move for a 62-year-old woman, but rage propelled her. She pulled the screwdriver from her sleeve and stabbed backward. Mark caught her wrist midair. His grip was like iron. He twisted. Joan gasped as pain shot up her arm. The screwdriver clattered to the floor. Mark kicked it away. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed. "Physical violence? Really, Joan? I expected a psychological dismantle. Tell me about your mother, Marcus. Isn't that how you people work?" He yanked her out of the chair. He was strong, terrifyingly so. "You want to play the invalid?" Mark hissed, dragging her toward the stairs. "Fine. Let's make it official." "What are you doing?" Joan screamed. "Sarah! Sarah! Scream all you want," Mark grunted, hauling her up the steps. She took 2 Ambien. She wouldn't wake up if the roof collapsed. He dragged her down the hallway, past Robert's study, past Sarah's closed door, and threw her into the master bedroom. Joan stumbled, falling onto the rug. She scrambled backward, Crab walking away from him. Mark stood in the doorway. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a key. The skeleton key for the old bedroom doors. "It's going to get cold tonight, Joan," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "The heating system is so unreliable in these old houses, especially when someone leaves the balcony door open." He walked across the room, unlocked the glass doors to the balcony, and threw them wide open. The blizzard roared in. Snow swirled into the bedroom instantly, freezing and violent. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in seconds. "Hypothermia is a peaceful way to go," Mark shouted over the wind. "You just go to sleep. And when they find you, it'll be tragic." Poor Dr. Miller, confused, wandered out onto the balcony, forgot where she was. He walked back to the hallway door. "No, Mark, please," Joan begged, the cold already biting through her thin blouse. "It's Marcus," he corrected. He stepped out. He slammed the heavy oak door. The lock clicked. Joan was alone, trapped in a freezing room with the storm pouring in. 2 hours had passed. The temperature in the bedroom was now well below freezing. Snow had accumulated in a drift near the open balcony doors, creeping across the Persian rug like a white fungus. Joan huddled in the corner furthest from the wind, wrapped in the duvet she had ripped from the bed. But it wasn't enough. Her teeth chattered so hard, her jaw ached. Her fingers were numb, clumsy, useless claws. "Stage 1, hypothermia," her clinical mind recited. Shivering, loss of fine motor skills, confusion. The fog was returning. Not the Alzheimer's fog, but the cold fog. It whispered to her. "Just close your eyes. It's warm in the dark." "No," Joan grit out. Her voice was a croak. "Not yet." She looked at the door. Locked. Solid oak. Robert had installed these doors for privacy, for soundproofing. Now, they were the lid of her coffin. She looked at the balcony. A 20-foot drop to the stone patio below. In this ice? Suicide. She needed to close the balcony doors. She had tried, but the wind was too strong, and the latch was frozen. She needed heat. Fire. She looked at the fireplace. Gas. Controlled by a remote. Where was the remote? On the mantel. Joan forced herself to stand. Her knees buckled. She screamed internally, forcing her legs to lock. She shuffled across the frozen room, the wind whipping her hair into her face. She reached the mantel. Her numb fingers fumbled for the remote. She pressed the on button. Click. Hiss. Nothing. No flame. Mark had cut the gas line to the bedroom. Of course he had. He was thorough. Joan collapsed onto the hearth rug. Despair, heavy and black, settled over her. She was going to die here, in the house she built, killed by the man she welcomed in. Sarah, she thought. Sarah will be next. That thought sparked a tiny flame in her chest. Anger. Pure, maternal rage. Joan rolled over. Her hand brushed against the fireplace tools. The poker, the brush, the shovel, and the heavy, cast-iron log grabber. She looked at the door again. Not the lock. The hinges. These were old-fashioned doors. The hinges were on the inside. Joan grabbed the poker. It was heavy iron. She crawled to the door. She wedged the sharp tip of the poker under the head of the bottom hinge pin. "Come on," she grunted. She used the heavy cast-iron tongs as a hammer, striking the handle of the poker to drive the wedge deeper. Clang. The sound was sharp, metallic, and deafening in the room. But the howling wind outside masked it perfectly. She hit it again. And again. The pin moved. A fraction of an inch. Yes, Joan wept. Yes, she worked with the desperation of a drowning woman. Her hands were bleeding, skin tearing against the cold metal. She didn't feel it. Top hinge, middle hinge, bottom hinge. It took an eternity, or maybe 10 minutes. Time had no meaning. Finally, the last pin clattered onto the floor. Joan dropped the tools. She braced her shoulder against the door frame and jammed the poker into the gap between the door and the jamb on the hinge side. She pulled with all her weight, using the poker as a lever. The wood groaned. The door, no longer anchored by the pins, peeled away from the frame on the hinge side, creating a narrow gap, wide enough to squeeze through. Joan slithered through the gap, tumbling out into the hallway. Watching a woman of Joan's age fight through the freezing cold and physical pain is a powerful testament to the human spirit. She is no longer just a doctor or a patient. She is a survivor, protecting what's left of her family. The house is dark, the predator is waiting, and the most intense part of this night is just moments away. The hallway was warm, or relatively warm. To Joan, it felt like a sauna. She lay on the carpet, gasping, feeling the blood painfully returning to her extremities. She was out, but she wasn't safe. The house was pitch black. The power was out. Mark must have cut the main breaker to disable the security system and the phones. She heard footsteps downstairs, heavy, pacing. Mark was patrolling, waiting for her to freeze. Joan stood up, swaying. She needed a weapon. The screwdriver was gone. She needed the phone. No, cell towers were down. She needed Elias. But how? She couldn't get to the neighbor's house in this storm without a coat, and Mark was guarding the exits. Then she remembered. The signal. She needed a light. A powerful light. She crept down the hallway, moving like a ghost. She headed for Sarah's old room, now a storage room. Robert kept his camping gear there. She opened the door silently. She fumbled in the dark, her hands searching the shelves. Sleeping bags. Tent. Where is it? Her hand closed around heavy rubber. The heavy-duty flashlight. The one Elias had given Robert years ago as a joke gift. For when you need to spot a bear or blind a burglar, Elias had said. She tested the switch. A beam of blinding white light cut through the darkness. She turned it off instantly. It worked. Now she had a way to signal, but she couldn't do it from here. The storage room faced the wrong way. She needed to get to the library. The library faced Elias's cabin, but the library was downstairs, where Mark was. Joan took a deep breath. She wasn't Dr. Miller anymore. She wasn't a victim. She was a mother protecting her cub. She gripped the heavy metal flashlight like a club. She moved to the top of the stairs. Below her, in the cavernous living room, a single candle flickered on the coffee table. Mark was sitting there, drinking Robert's whiskey. He looked relaxed. He looked victorious. He didn't know the door upstairs was open. He didn't know the prey was loose. Joan took the first step down. The hunt was on. But this time, the rabbit had teeth. Joan descended the stairs, one agony at a time. Her joints, frozen stiff from the bedroom, screamed with every movement. But her mind was a diamond, hard, cold, and unbreakable. Halfway down, a floorboard groaned. A treacherous, high-pitched creak that cut through the silence like a gunshot. In the living room below, Mark stopped mid-sip. He lowered the crystal tumbler of whiskey. He didn't turn around immediately. He sat on the sofa, facing the fireplace where a single candle burned, casting long, dancing shadows. "You're like a cockroach, Joan," Mark said, his voice amused, slurring slightly. "Hard to kill." He stood up and turned slowly. The flickering candlelight illuminated his face. The handsome mask was gone. In its place was something feral, flushed with alcohol and the adrenaline of murder. "How did you get out?" he asked, taking a step toward the stairs. "I have the key." Joan gripped the heavy flashlight behind her back, hiding it in the folds of her skirt. She was trapped. She was halfway down the stairs, exposed. If she ran, he would catch her. If she fought, he would break her. Think, Joan, what does a narcissist crave? Validation, control, superiority. She needed to give him what he wanted. Joan let her body go slack. She slumped against the banister, allowing her face to lose its focus. Her eyes, sharp a moment ago, went wide and vacant. She tilted her head, looking not at Mark, but through him. "Robert?" she whispered. Mark stopped. He blinked, confused. "What?" Joan took a shaky step down, extending a trembling hand. A smile of pure, heartbreaking relief spread across her face. "Oh, Robert," she breathed, her voice filled with a confusing mix of love and senility. "You're home. I was so worried. The storm. It's so loud." Mark stared at her. He looked at the bruised wrists where he had grabbed her earlier. He looked at her disheveled hair. He was analyzing her, looking for the lie. "I'm not Robert, you stupid old hag," Mark sneered, but he didn't lunge. He was curious. "Don't be silly, darling," Joan continued, descending another step. She was fully committed to the role now. "I know you're upset about the patient, the one with the father issues, but you don't have to shout." She reached the bottom of the stairs. She was 5 feet away from him. She could smell the expensive scotch on his breath. "You're confusing me with your dead husband," Mark laughed. A cruel, barking sound. "This is rich. The great Dr. Miller, reduced to a ghost story. "I made you tea," Joan murmured, walking past him. It was a terrifying gamble. She turned her back on the killer, exposing her neck, trusting that his arrogance would keep him from striking. "It's in the library, where you left it." She drifted toward the library door, the room that faced Elias's cabin. Mark watched her go. He was fascinated. This was the ultimate victory for him. He hadn't just killed her body, he had broken her mind. She was so broken, she was seeing ghosts. "The library is locked, Joan," Mark taunted, following her lazily. "Remember? We locked it to keep you safe." Joan reached the double doors of the library. She tried the handle. Locked. She turned to Mark, her eyes welling with confused tears. But the music," she whimpered. "I need to turn off the music, Robert. It's too loud." Mark stood right in front of her. He looked down, swirling his drink. "There is no music, Joan." "Yes, yes." She grabbed his lapels, shaking him weakly. "Please, Robert, open the door. Let me turn it off. My head, it hurts so much." She collapsed against his chest, sobbing. Mark sighed. He felt powerful. He felt like a god. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the master key ring. "Fine," he muttered. "I'll open the door. Then I'm going to take you to the basement. It's quieter there." He didn't notice that while she was clinging to him, her right hand had shifted the heavy flashlight to a better grip. Mark inserted the key. Click. The lock tumbled. He pushed the door open. "After you, Robert," he mocked, gesturing into the dark room. Joan stumbled inside. Mark followed, stepping across the threshold. "Now," Mark said, reaching for the light switch that wouldn't work. "Where is this music?" Joan turned. The vacancy left her eyes instantly. The weeping stopped. She looked at him with the cold, hard stare of a judge delivering a death sentence. "The music is over, Marcus." She swung the heavy flashlight with both hands. She didn't aim for his head, he was too tall, and he might block it. She aimed for the structural weakness she had spotted earlier when he limped. She swung it low, with every ounce of desperate strength she had left, squarely into his kneecap. There's a quiet justice in seeing a narcissist's arrogance become his downfall. Mark never expected the confused old woman to have teeth. Joan has finally turned the tables, but with the storm raging and Sarah still in danger, the battle is far from over. Let's see if Elias Thorne sees the signal in time to end this nightmare once and for all. Crack. Mark screamed a high, animalistic sound of pure agony. His leg buckled backward. He collapsed to the floor, clutching his knee, the whiskey glass shattering around him. Joan didn't wait to watch him fall. She slammed the library doors shut. She turned the thumb lock on the inside. She was in. He was out. But a wooden door wouldn't hold a monster for long. The library was pitch black, smelling of old paper and the ozone of the storm. Outside the door, Mark was howling. "You bitch! I'll kill you. I'll tear you apart." Thud. Something heavy hit the door. His shoulder, or his good leg. Joan ignored him. Her heart was beating so fast it felt like a hummingbird trapped in her ribcage. She fumbled for the flashlight she had dropped after the strike. Her fingers brushed the cold metal. She grabbed it and scrambled toward the large bay window on the north wall. This window faced the woods, faced Elias Thorne's cabin. She reached the window. It was covered in frost, a thick, opaque layer of ice crystals. She couldn't see out. Elias couldn't see in. Think, she gasped. She used the butt of the flashlight to scrape the ice. Scritch, scritch. It was too slow. The ice was too thick. Behind her, the library door frame splintered. Mark was throwing his entire body weight against it. He was adrenaline-fueled, pain-maddened. Heat. She needed heat. Joan gripped the heavy metal flashlight. Using the edge of the bezel, she vigorously scraped at the thick frost on the pane. Her movements were frantic, the ice flying off in small white shards. Finally, she cleared a narrow strip of glass, wide enough to reveal the black void of the forest. Pitch blackness. The storm was a wall of white, but faintly, distantly, she saw a yellow blur. Elias's porch light? No, it was gone. But there was a faint glow from a window. He was awake. The code. Joan raised the flashlight. She pressed the heavy rubber button. A beam of pure white light, incredibly bright, cut through the darkness of the library and blasted out into the snowy night. She didn't know Morse code for SOS. She panicked. Short, short, short. Long, long, long. Short, short, short. She repeated it. Flash, 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 flash. Open this door, Mark roared. Crack! The wood around the lock gave way. The door burst open, swinging wildly on broken hinges. Mark stood in the doorway. He was leaning heavily on his good leg, his face pale and slick with sweat, his teeth bared in a rictus of hate. In his hand, he held a syringe. Game over, Mom, he hissed. Joan kept flashing the light. Please, Elias. Look at me. Look at the annoyance. Look at the strobe light you hate so much. Mark limped forward. He was slow, but the room was small. You think that light is going to save you? Mark sneered, dragging his shattered leg. No one is coming. The roads are blocked. The phones are down. It's just you and me. Joan turned off the light. She set the flashlight on the windowsill. She turned to face him. She had nowhere left to run. The window didn't open. The door was blocked by him. You're right, Joan said softly. She backed up until her spine hit the bookshelves. No one is coming to save me. Mark laughed, wincing as he put weight on his bad leg. Finally. Acceptance. That's the final stage of grief, isn't it? He raised the syringe. It was filled with a clear liquid. Insulin? Morphine? Enough to stop an old woman's heart. Now, Mark whispered, inches from her face. Be a good patient and hold still. Joan looked past him, out the window where her handprints were slowly freezing over again. There was no response from the cabin. No return signal. Elias hadn't seen it, or he didn't care. Mark grabbed her arm. The needle glinted in the gloom, but Joan didn't struggle. She stared into Mark's eyes, summoning the last shred of Dr. Miller. You forgot one thing about narcissists, Marcus, she said, her voice steady. Mark paused, the needle hovering over her skin. What? They never look behind them. Smash. The bay window exploded inward. Glass shards sprayed across the room like diamonds. The wind roared in, carrying snow and fury. Mark spun around, shielding his face. Standing in the broken window frame, silhouetted against the storm, was a figure. He wore a snow-covered parka. He held a scoped hunting rifle, and he looked very, very annoyed. I told you, Elias Thorne grumbled, racking the bolt of his rifle with a metallic clack. Your damn lights are keeping me awake. Mark raised the syringe, turning toward the intruder. A reflex action. Boom. The sound of the rifle in the enclosed space was deafening. Mark didn't scream. He just flew backward, lifted off his feet by the force of the impact, and slammed into the bookshelf. The syringe skittered across the floor. He slid down the books, clutching his shoulder. Not dead, but neutralized. Elias stepped into the room, boots crunching on the glass. He lowered the rifle, looking at Joan. He tilted his head toward the flashlight sitting on the sill. 3 shorts, 3 longs, 3 shorts, Elias said, his voice dry. Sloppy technique, Doc. Your rhythm was off. Joan slid down the wall until she hit the floor. She started to laugh. A hysterical, sobbing laugh. I'll practice, she choked out. Elias looked at Mark, who was groaning on the floor, then back at Joan. He offered her a gloved hand. Come on. My coffee is better than whatever you got in this hellhole. Joan took his hand. It was rough, calloused, and the warmest thing she had ever felt. The wind continued to howl through the shattered window, but inside the library, the storm had shifted. Mark lay slumped against the bookcase, clutching his bleeding shoulder. His face was gray, slick with shock, but his eyes were still darting around, calculating, scheming. Even with a bullet in him, the narcissist believed he could talk his way out. Elias stood over him like a statue carved from granite. The rifle barrel pointed unwaveringly at Mark's chest. Don't move, Elias growled. I aim for the leg next time, and I don't miss. You crazy old fool, Mark gasped, his voice thin. You broke into my home. You shot me. I'm calling the police. You'll die in prison. Police are on their way, Marcus, Elias said, the rifle as steady as a heartbeat. Marcus didn't flinch. Even bleeding, he tilted his head toward Sarah, a haunting, jagged laugh escaping his lips. Do you think a cage can hold a mind like mine, Sarah? I didn't just want the money. I wanted to see the exact moment the great Robert Miller's legacy, his wife and his daughter realized they were nothing but footnotes in my masterpiece. I am the only thing you will ever remember clearly. Mom! A scream from the hallway. Sarah, She stumbled into the library, looking groggy, her hair wild, wearing a silk robe. She stared at the broken window, the snow on the floor, the blood, and finally, her husband gunned down by the neighbor. "Oh my God, Mark!" Sarah rushed forward, dropping to her knees beside him. She looked at Joan with horror. "Mom? What happened? What did you do?" Mark seized the moment. He grabbed Sarah's hand, squeezing it with his bloody fingers. "Sarah, baby," he choked out, summoning tears. "Your mother," she snapped. "She tried to stab me. She let him in. They're trying to kill me. You have to help me." Sarah turned to Joan, tears streaming down her face. "Mom, is this true? Did you arrange this?" Joan stood by the window, shivering in the cold air. She looked at her daughter, the child she had raised, the woman who was so desperate for love she had married a monster. "Sarah," Joan said softly, "look at him." "He's bleeding!" Sarah screamed. "No. Look at his eyes." Sarah froze. She looked down at Mark. He was panting, playing the victim, but his grip on her wrist was painful, possessive. "He drugged you, Sarah," Joan said, her voice gaining strength. "He cut the phone lines. He locked me in the master bedroom with the balcony open. He wanted me to freeze to death so he could inherit the estate." "Liar!" Mark shouted, spitting blood. "She's demented, Sarah. She doesn't know what she's saying. She thinks I'm her dead husband." Sarah looked torn, her world fracturing. She wanted to believe her husband. It was easier to believe her mother was sick than to believe her marriage was a lie. "Mom, maybe you're confused," Sarah whispered. Joan walked over to the desk. The turntable was there. The record disc 4 was still inside the magic flute box where she had shoved it. "Elias," Joan said. "Keep him still." She took the record out. Her hands were steady now. She placed it on the platter. She realized the belt was off. With a surge of adrenaline, she reattached it in seconds. "What are you doing?" Mark hissed. Panic, real panic, finally entered his voice. "Don't touch that." Joan dropped the needle. Hiss. Crackle. Then, the voice filled the room. Mark's voice. Young, arrogant, confessing to the murder of his own father, confessing his plan to marry Sarah for revenge. "Maybe I'll marry your daughter. Wouldn't that be poetic? To take everything you love, piece by piece." Sarah went still. She stopped crying. She stared at the spinning black disc. Then slowly, terrifyingly, she turned her head to look at Mark. Mark didn't deny it this time. He couldn't. The mask fell off completely, shattering on the floor. He looked at Sarah not with love, but with pure, unadulterated contempt. "Turn it off," Mark snarled. "Turn that garbage off." Sarah stood up. She backed away from him as if he were radioactive. "You," Sarah whispered. "You killed your father? You hate me?" "Oh, grow up, Sarah," Mark spat, wincing as he tried to shift his weight. "I tolerated you. For 15 years, I played the part of the doting husband, enduring your whining and your boring little life, all to ensure I'd be the one holding the pen when it came time to sign away your mother's soul. I watched your father look at me with those judgmental eyes for months in Chicago. He thought he could cure me, label me, and tuck me away in a file cabinet. He died thinking he won. But I've been the one living in his house, sleeping in his bed, and now I'm the one who will write the final chapter of his legacy. You were never more than a key to this front door, Sarah. And for what? For this?" He gestured around the room. "I earned this house. I earned every penny. I did what needed to be done while you played house." He looked at Joan. "And you," he sneered. "You should have just died in the snow. It would have been cleaner." Sarah's face hardened. The weeping girl vanished. In her place stood the daughter of Dr. Joan Miller. She walked over to the fireplace tools. She picked up the heavy iron poker Joan had used to break the door hinges. "Sarah?" Mark asked, suddenly wary. Sarah walked back to him. She didn't strike him. She simply leaned down and pried his bloody fingers off her robe. "My mother," Sarah said, her voice trembling with a new kind of power, "may have trouble remembering where her keys are, but she remembers who loves her, and she remembers who you are. There is no sound more devastating than the silence of a heart breaking as it finally sees the truth about someone it loved. Sarah has found her voice, and together with Joan, they are standing against the monster who tried to tear them apart. Stay tuned for the final conclusion, where justice finally finds its way through the mountain snow. Sirens wailed in the distance, cutting through the storm. Blue and red lights flashed against the snow, dancing through the broken window. Joan walked over to her daughter and wrapped her arms around her. Sarah buried her face in Joan's shoulder, sobbing. Elias lowered his rifle slightly, but kept his eyes on Mark. "Hell of a recording, Doc," Elias grunted. "Better than Mozart." Joan looked at the man on the floor, the architect of lies, now broken and exposed. "Yes," Joan whispered, stroking her daughter's hair. "It's the sound of truth." Weeks later, Joan sat in the same high-backed chair, but the air in the courtroom no longer felt heavy with tragedy. When the gavel struck the mahogany bench, the sound didn't remind her of breaking bone anymore. It sounded like a door finally locking shut, keeping the monster on the other side. But this time, everything was different. Judge Holloway slammed the folder shut. He peered over his glasses, but this time, he wasn't looking at the documents. He was staring directly at Mark Sterling. Mark was no longer sitting in the gallery with Sarah. He was seated at the defense table, wearing an orange jumpsuit, his shoulder heavily bandaged, his wrists shackled to the steel bar of the table. "As I stated," Judge Holloway said, his voice cutting through the tension, "the petition filed argued that Dr. Miller was incapable of rational decision-making. However," he paused, holding up a flash drive, the digitized version of the vinyl record. "The evidence presented, specifically the audio recordings and the sworn testimony of Mr. Elias Thorne, proves otherwise. The only individual operating with deceit and malice in this case is you, Mr. Sterling." Mark's face crumpled. The arrogant mask was gone, replaced by the pale look of a trapped animal. "The petition for conservatorship is dismissed with prejudice," the judge declared firmly. "Furthermore, based on the evidence of identity theft and admission of guilt provided to the district attorney, I am revoking your bond. You are remanded to custody to await trial for the first-degree murder of your father, Frank Reynolds." The judge looked at the bailiffs. "Take him away." 2 bailiffs moved in. They hauled Mark to his feet. As they dragged him past Joan, he lunged, straining against the cuffs. "She's crazy," Mark screamed, frothing. "She doesn't even know what day it is. Ask her. Ask her what day it is." The courtroom fell silent. Everyone looked at Joan. Sarah looked terrified. Joan stood up slowly. She smoothed her blazer. She looked at Mark with clarity and pity. "It is Tuesday, Marcus," she said calmly. "It is the day you lose everything." The bailiffs dragged him out, his screams echoing down the marble hallway until the heavy doors slammed shut. Sarah hugged her mother tight. "Let's go home, Mom." "Yes," Joan said. "Let's go home." 6 months later, spring had arrived in the mountains. The snow was gone. The mountains were alive with the vibrant green of new pine needles and wildflowers. Joan sat on the back porch, a blanket over her legs, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of violet and gold. The house was different now. The heavy drapes were gone, replaced by sheer curtains that let the light in. The magic flute box set was gone, handed over to the FBI as evidence, but the music remained. Inside, Sarah was playing the piano. Claire de Lune. She was learning. It wasn't perfect, she missed a note here and there, but it was real. "You're gonna catch a cold, Doc." Joan turned. Elias was standing at the edge of the porch. He wasn't wearing his parka today, just a flannel shirt. He held 2 mugs of coffee. "It's 60 degrees, Elias," Joan smiled. "I think I'll survive." Elias grunted, handing her a mug. He sat in the rocking chair beside her. He had taken down the no trespassing sign between their properties. He had even, grudgingly, adopted a stray cat that Joan's memory kept forgetting to feed. "How's the head today?" Elias asked, taking a sip. "Better," Joan admitted. "Dr. Evans has me on a new protocol. And Sarah. Sarah helps with the notes." She looked at the yellow sticky note stuck to her coffee mug. "Drink while hot." Sarah's handwriting. "They say the fog will get thicker," Joan said quietly, looking at the mountains. "Eventually, I won't remember this winter. I won't remember Mark. I might not even remember you." Elias looked at her over the rim of his mug. His blue sniper eyes were soft. "That's okay," he said. "I got a good memory. I'll remember for both of us." Joan smiled, tears pricking her eyes. She reached out and took his rough hand. "Thank you, Elias. Don't get mushy on me." He pulled his hand away, but not before giving hers a squeeze. "Just drink your coffee." Marcus thought the fog in her brain was the perfect prison to hide his crimes. But he was mistaken. Truth doesn't require a perfect memory to survive. It only needs a heart resilient enough to never give up. Now, with justice served, Marcus faces the cold stone walls of a cell, a place where his cunning no longer has an audience. And as for Joan, she is still learning to live within the fog. There are days she forgets her keys, and days she even forgets her own name. But she will never forget the feeling of being free. Her story serves as a reminder. The weakest among us is not the one burdened by illness, but the one devoid of a conscience. Justice may arrive late, like a storm in the dead of night, but it will inevitably sweep away every lie.